Hello and welcome back to chapter 13. We're on to section 7 now, elasticity. So this is a continuation of the subject of demand and supply. So what is elasticity? Well, there are different types of elasticity actually. What we're going to do is start with this one, which is price elasticity of demand. Okay, price elasticity of demand is defined as the extent of a change in demand given a change in price. So it's a measure of responsiveness. It's the responsiveness of demand to a change in price. So if you change your price by 10%, does demand change by more or less than 10%? If it changes by more than 10%, we might call that elastic. If it changes by less than 10%, we might call that inelastic. So elastic means it's responsive, inelastic means it's unresponsive. Now you may well have to calculate price elasticity of demand, okay, in which case you do need to remember this formula. It's defined as the percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. Okay, so remember quantity on top, price on the bottom. So percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. How do you measure the percentage change? Well, you do this. So you take the new quantity minus the old quantity divided by the old quantity. So that gives you the percentage change in quantity, and divide that by new price minus old price divided by old price. So the percentage change in price. Put it through your calculator, okay, and what will happen is it should always come out with a negative value, or almost always come out with a negative value, because of the downward sloping demand curve. So as we know, they've got an inverse relationship, but the convention is to ignore the minus sign. Okay, now what we're going to find, and we'll do some numbers shortly, is that if this gives you a figure of less than 1, then we say demand is inelastic. It's not particularly responsive to the change in price. If it's more than 1, it's called elastic, and if it equals exactly 1, which it never would in real life, but it can do in questions, that's called unit elasticity. So let's have a work through this one together. The price of a good is £1.20 and demand is 800,000. Market research indicates that an increase in price of 10 pence per unit will result in a fall in demand of 70,000 units. So what is the price elasticity of demand? So we need to take quantity on top. So new quantity would be £730,000 units minus the original quantity divided by the original quantity, all divided by the same formula with price. So new price, £1.30, minus original price divided by original price. Okay, so that gives us a percentage change in quantity of 8.75%, and it gives us a percentage change in price of 8.33%. One goes up and one goes down, but so we ignore the minus sign. So that gives us a price elasticity of demand equal to 1.05. Because that exceeds 1, we would say that is an elastic demand. Okay, you see why we call it elastic or responsive, that quantity demanded changed by a greater percentage than the change in price. So it's responsive, it's an elastic demand. So a bit of repetition in 7.2, again defining elastic and inelastic, so we don't need to go through that. Some special values. Demand is perfectly inelastic if it's 0. Okay, it doesn't change at all when price changes. Now, effectively what that means is you have a vertical demand curve. The opposite of that is a perfectly elastic demand curve. And again, these are just sort of theoretical concepts, really. But that would be a horizontal demand curve. Okay, what that means is if there's a slight increase in price, the demand is infinite. Yeah, and if there's a slight decrease in price, sorry, I got that the wrong way around, didn't I? If there's a slight increase in price, there is no demand at all. It disappears altogether. If there's a slight decrease in price, then demand is infinite. Okay, and obviously we can't depict infinity on a graph, so the best we can do is our horizontal straight line. Unit elasticity of demand is where price elasticity of demand equals 1. Okay, now it is possible to draw a curve like that. Okay, and it's a sort of curve like that. I think the official term for that, thinking back to when I used to do a bit of maths, it's something about a rectangular hyperbola. Okay, the thing about a rectangular hyperbola is the area under the curve is always exactly the same. So whichever point we choose, price multiplied by quantity would always give you exactly the same amount. Now, what's the significance of this? Why do we care how responsive demand is to a change in price? Well, it affects total expenditure. So if, for instance, you have elastic demand, you've got a fairly sort of gentle sloping demand curve. I just changed colour. And maybe you set off at that point. That's quantity and that's price. Total expenditure is that shaded area, isn't it? It's price times quantity. If you were then to increase your price, not even by very much, there's quite a big shift along that demand curve, isn't there? And what you would find with the new price and quantity is that total expenditure falls. And that might be quite significant for the business. Yeah, so an elastic demand curve, when you increase price, total expenditure falls. The opposite is true, isn't it? If you reduce price, total expenditure increases. Inelastic demand is the exact opposite. So let's see if I can squeeze one of those in here. Okay, inelastic demand curves are very steep. So what happens here, let's say we set off at this price and quantity, and we then increase the price. Even if we increase the price significantly, the point is demand doesn't fall very much. So with an inelastic demand curve, if you increase price, total expenditure rises. And if you decrease price, total expenditure falls. Okay, now just bear in mind we're not talking about profits here. In order to think about profits, we'd have to introduce costs. Okay, but this is revenue. So elasticity is useful in predicting what a firm's revenue will be. Now, just to finish that subject off, unit elasticity, as I sort of half explained back here, revenue is always the same. Yeah, price times quantity, no matter where you are, is always the same. Now, that's never going to be the case in real life, is it? But there is a mathematical curve which you can draw, which has that quality. That's unit elasticity. Now, this interactive question sort of repeats what we've just been saying, but put some numbers to it. So I'm not proposing to work through that with you. Okay, pause the lecture now and have a work through yourself. Okay, and you'll find all the answers in the study manual. Okay, but that's just a practice on what we've just been talking about. So I will skip through that. and cover these next couple of terms. And this really is just remembering a definition or two. We've got two strange types of goods. Okay, first one is called a Giffen good. Okay, named after this economist who spotted this quite a long time ago. And what he said is, although we normally expect goods to have a downward sloping demand curve, okay, sometimes it's actually the opposite. It's an upward sloping demand curve. Okay, now this guy Giffen noticed this with bread. Okay, very poor households. Okay, if the price of bread went up, what happened is those households bought more of the bread. Okay, now the problem was that these poor households spent a very high proportion of their income on bread. So as soon as the price went up, they couldn't afford to buy anything else, so they bought even more bread. Yeah. So goods with an upward sloping demand curve are sometimes referred to as Giffen goods. Okay, now the other kind of good with an upward sloping demand curve are what we call goods of ostentation. So goods with some sort of snob value, where the only reason people want them is because they are expensive. So you put the price up, and lo and behold, more people want it. Okay, and the guy who observed that phenomenon was called Veblen. So we sometimes call those Veblen goods. So we've got various elasticities of demand. Now, what affects elasticity? Well, a number of factors. First of all, the availability of substitutes. If it's very easy for you to find a substitute, you will tend to have an elastic demand. Yeah. So, for instance, I don't know, beer. Let's say, I don't know whether you drink beer. Okay, let's say it's the price of Foster's or something. Okay, the price of Foster's goes up. Okay, how easy is it for you to find a substitute for Foster's? Well, it's pretty easy, isn't it? Yeah, you could find a whole range of other types of beer, or you could switch to wine or spirits. Okay, lots of substitutes there, so quite an elastic demand curve. The time horizon. Okay, as we've said, the longer the time period that you're considering, the more elastic the demand curve will be. Okay, in a very short space of time, it's difficult for buyers to adjust their habits. Okay, they might not even notice the price has gone up. Yeah, it might take a little while to respond. But the longer the time horizon, the more elastic the demand curve will be. Competitors' actions will also affect elasticity. So if you put your prices up and your competitors wouldn't respond, they would keep their prices the same, then you would expect an elastic demand curve. Okay, your customers will switch to your competitors. If you were to reduce your price, perhaps your competitors would follow suit in that case because they'd be scared of losing business to you, in which case you might have inelastic demand. Okay, and we sometimes refer to this phenomenon actually as a kinked demand curve. So that if you find yourself at this point here, the demand curve is kinked, it's bent. If you put your prices up, nobody follows suit, so it's elastic. But if you put your prices down, everyone follows suit, so at that point it's inelastic. Luxuries versus necessities. If it's a necessity, price goes up, you really don't have a choice, do you? You still have to buy it. So that would have an inelastic demand curve. So things like petrol, I don't know, peak rail travel, put the prices up, you still got to get to work. So it's an inelastic demand curve. Whereas luxuries, you can do without. So they tend to be more elastic. The proportion of your income which is spent on a particular good can affect elasticity. So if you spend a very small proportion of your income, then you really don't care actually if the price goes up. Yeah, so I don't know, the price of a box of matches. I don't even know how much a box of matches costs, but if the price of matches doubled, I would still buy the same number of boxes, just so I can light the barbecue in the summer or light the fire in the winter. Yeah, and I probably wouldn't even notice. It's such a small part of my weekly expenditure. And finally, habit-forming goods. Well, they're effectively necessities, aren't they? Yeah. So again, they would have an inelastic demand. Now, continuing this theme of elasticity, we move on from price elasticity to something called income elasticity. And it's a similar thing, except this time it's the responsiveness of demand, not to a change in price, but to a change in income. And the calculation is very, very similar. Okay, percentage change in demand divided by percentage change in income. Yeah, so you just change the bottom of the fraction. Now with income elasticity, the thing that you tend to be tested on is whether your income elasticity is positive or negative. Okay, if your income elasticity is positive, then you're looking at a normal good. Okay, income goes up and demand goes up. They move in the same direction. That's a normal good, isn't it? We've already seen that. Whereas if your income elasticity is negative, they move in opposite directions. That's what we call an inferior good then, isn't it? So your income goes up and then you buy less of it. Now you could sometimes take that even further, and you can say if you're looking at a good which is income elastic, so the income elasticity is greater than 1, then that may well be a luxury good. So you get a pay rise and suddenly you splash out on that foreign holiday or that new TV. Okay, equally if your income goes down, they're the things you can do without. So that's quite responsive to a change in income. Whereas if you're looking at an income inelastic good, so between 0 and 1, that may well be a necessity. You can't do without it. So not as responsive to a change in income. A third type of elasticity is called cross elasticity. And this measures the responsiveness of demand for one product with a change in the price of another product. So again, it's a very, very similar formula, except that you've got percentage change in quantity of good A on the top divided by the percentage change in price of good B on the bottom of the fraction. Okay, now again, the key thing here is this cross elasticity positive or negative? Okay, and this depends whether the goods are substitutes or complements. So see if you can work this through in your mind. It says if the two goods are substitutes, the cross elasticity will be positive. They'll move in the same direction. So substitutes, we said that would be something like coffee and tea, didn't we? So think about that. If there's an increase in the price of tea, what would happen to the quantity of coffee which was demanded? Well, it should go up, shouldn't it? Because nobody's buying tea anymore, everyone is buying coffee instead. So they move in the same direction, so it's positive. What about complements? Well, we said tea and biscuits. So let me just get rid of that, and we'll try it again. So let's say there's an increase in the price of tea. What will happen to the demand for biscuits? Well, that will then go down. Yeah, if there's an increase in the price of tea, we don't buy tea anymore, and therefore we buy fewer biscuits. They move in opposite directions, and therefore when you put it through your calculator, you end up with a negative figure. Okay, now you can just imagine, can't you, getting questions on this in the exam, so you've just got to take your time, okay, think very clearly. Okay, positive cross elasticity means substitutes. Negative cross elasticity means complements. Personally, I wouldn't try to memorize that fact, right, but be able to think it through logically. Now, just as we have elasticity of demand, we have elasticity of supply. And it's the same thing. It's a measure of the responsiveness of supply to a change in price. And I'm sure by now you can guess what the formula is. Percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. So you can see, can't you, with all these formulas, it's always quantity that goes on top. Yeah, whether it's price elasticity or cross elasticity or income elasticity, it's always quantity on top and then something else on the bottom. Now again, different sort of ranges of elasticity could be perfectly inelastic. And again, a bit like demand, a perfectly inelastic supply curve is just the vertical line. You could have unit elasticity of supply, and that is any straight line which goes through the origin, which goes through the intersection of the x and y axis. Okay, and that's just a sort of mathematical relationship. You can prove that to yourself if you've got nothing better to do tonight. Perfectly elastic, again, is a horizontal line. But in reality, we'll be somewhere in between, won't we? So, relatively inelastic will just be a steeply sloping supply curve. Relatively elastic will be a relatively gently sloping supply curve. Now, elasticity of supply in particular depends on the time period that we're looking at. Okay, and there are three different periods. There's what we call the market period, the short run, and the long run. Okay, in the market period, we're talking about a time period that is so short that the only thing we've got is our existing levels of stock. So in effect, we've got a fixed supply curve, and we can't react at all to a change in price. So in effect, you've got a perfectly inelastic supply curve for that period. Now, in the short run, what you can do is you can increase or decrease your output, but you don't have enough time to buy any more plant and machinery or indeed any more buildings. So you can take on more workers. You can make them work overtime if you like. So you can increase or decrease your output to an extent, but you don't have enough time to undertake any sort of fixed capital investment. In the long run, you can change everything. You take on more workers, you can buy more equipment, you can buy more buildings, and in the long run, new suppliers can enter the industry as well. So as we work our way through these time periods, what we find is supply becomes more responsive, more elastic. Now that's the end of section 7, and we're about to move on to section 8, types of market structure, which is actually a completely different subject. So I think this is a good place to pause. So I'm going to stop this podcast at that point, and then this chapter will just take one more lecture where we'll go from chapter 8 through to the end. So as usual, have a break, have a rest, stretch your legs, and when you're ready, come and join me for the grand finale.